Welcome to part 2 of Polarity versus Phase. In this episode, I'm going to show you how phase and polarity affect drums and guitars. Check it out. One of the most important places where this comes into play is with the miking of drums, and especially the snare drum. Because of the springs underneath, people want to mic it so that you can pick it up. Because if you don't, it sounds like this. Here it is with both mics on, and here it is with the bottom mic off. Now, the issue is that with two mics on the same source, they need to pick up the sound at the same distance, otherwise the waveforms don't line up. But with the snare drum being mic'd on the bottom, what happens is as you hit that top head, the head is moving away from this mic, but it's actually moving towards, all the pressure is moving towards the bottom mic. And then as the head springs back up or bounces back up, it's moving away from the bottom mic, but towards the top mic. Thus, you're going to get the opposite. If you don't hit the phase button on the mic pre for the bottom mic, it'll look like this. And the two mics will be out of phase. Check it out. I'm going to give you some examples. Here's what it sounds like without flipping the phase or polarity on the bottom mic. Flip the phase. Here it is before I switch the polarity. And here is after. Huge difference in tone and volume. Now, the reason the sound doesn't completely disappear when the two mics are out of phase, like when I have the pure tones and they're out of phase from each other and disappearing, is because the sound's not exactly the same coming off the bottom head and the top head, so a lot of the sound's going to remain, but mostly it's the low end that gets sucked out because those are bigger waveforms and it's easier for them to be lined up or out of line. I just want to also say that I said phase and polarity because on that mic pre it says polarity, and over here on my ISA 110 it says phase, and over here on my germanium it says phase, and on my Summit Tube Direct box, it says polarity. So, hey, I got a good excuse why I get them mixed up, okay? Now, another area where phase or polarity is really important with drums is with the overheads. Now, most people tend to put their overheads kind of high up, and that's cool. But the problem is, as you move those mics up and down, it's going to change the relationship of the sound coming into the snare mic versus the overheads, because those snare mics right next to the snare, boom, the sound's in there. It's traveling through the air and hitting those overheads later. So it might be totally out of phase, kind of halfway out of phase, but it can totally affect the sound of the whole drum kit. Now, I tend to keep my overheads pretty low, and I get a tight sound. So I'm going to play you an example right here of what I've got, and then I'm going to flip the phase on the overheads and you hear the difference. Check it out. Here it is, how I recorded it. I'm going to flip the phase. Now back in. You want to flip it again, back out. I mean, you can hear a big difference in the snare drum and the room sound. Everything gets a little thinner and boxier sounding. I recorded it so that the snare and the overheads are pretty close. You're never going to get them exactly the same, but I got them pretty close, and it makes a really huge difference in the sound. Now, another area where the relationship of the phase between microphones is very important is in miking amps. A lot of people just put one mic on the amp. I'll often have multiple ones on the front. I'm not going to show that right now. I'll show that in a minute. But one of the things I really like to do is with combo amps is to put a mic in the back. There's an incredible amount of great low end that comes out of the back of these amplifiers. So I'll always stick something back here. This is a Sennheiser 421, and I'll switch out mics on that. But the main thing I do is I spend a lot of time positioning this mic so that it's actually very out of phase with the front mic. And then I'll switch the polarity on the mic pre so I get a really full sound. Let me show you what it sounds like. All right, so here it is with just the front mic. I'll bring in the rear mic. Add some nice low end to it. Turn it back off. So I started with the rear mic out of phase from the front mic because it's kind of like the snare drum thing where the direction that the speaker's moving is like the direction that the head's moving. But as usual with this stuff, it never is a science. I ended up pulling the mic further out from the inside of the rear of the amp. And strangely enough, I've noticed that if I actually keep it in phase, check it out. Here it is, how I had it. But if I switch the phase back in, it's even more low end. I actually like that. And I had pulled the mic out a little further, so that might have something to do with it. All those tones from one pickup selection and 2 mics. Let me show you another cool thing you can do with phase. So sometimes I like to combine a dynamic and a condenser on the front of the amp. I line them up and get them perfectly in phase because it can give this really rich sound that's kind of like this. Now, of course, if I throw it out of phase, it's going to suck out a lot of the sound. But what's really cool is if I start moving the second mic back a little bit, intentionally throwing it out of phase from the other mic, that's pretty cool. Check it out. So I just moved the 414 about 3.5 inches out. This is what it sounds like with just the 57. Now here it is with the 414 added in. Getting a little funkier. Now let's throw it out of phase. Got a funky sound to it. Let's try pulling it out a little bit more. So I just pulled the 414 out about 5 inches. Here it is with just the 57. And now here it is with the 414 5 inches out. Cool. And now let's throw that out of phase, the 414 out of phase. It's getting funkier, man. Let's pull it out some more. So this is with the 414 10 inches out. Here it is with just the 57. Here it is with the 414 10 inches out. I'm going to throw that out of phase. Pretty cool, man. I had it in a different pickup selection. Here's what I was usually using. Here it is, 57. 414. Phase. I mean, all these tones. Man, so many unique tones and sounds you can get by just moving the mics around. And I didn't even talk about angling the microphones, which is pretty cool. So you don't have to rely on your tone knobs and EQs to come up with something unique. Next, I'm going to talk about the acoustic guitar. Oh, and I should explain that I'm wearing this white shirt so that you can hopefully better see the microphones. Everything's so dark in here. Now, one thing that I and a lot of people like to do is record acoustic guitar with a combination of a small condenser microphone and a large diaphragm condenser microphone. And the reason is the large diaphragm condenser is going to pick up a lot of body, whereas the small diaphragm is going to get a lot of that zing and the sparkle on the top end. But you got to make sure they're lined up perfectly. Now, I've got these pretty damn perfectly in phase. And if you look carefully, I don't know if you can see it on the cameras or not, it's going to look like the 414 is slightly ahead of the Josephson, but that's just because of the grill. It makes it look like it's further out, but their diaphragms are totally lined up. So check it out. Here's what it sounds like. Now, if I switch the polarity on one of the mics, you can hear the difference, like how much goes away. A lot. So that is switching the polarity on the mic. But now, let me switch it back. Now I'm going to actually affect the phase, because as I said earlier in the video, the phase has a lot to do with timing. Like something's getting out of phase and slowly getting out of, I guess, polarity is because it's coming later. The time is getting off. So I'm going to play here, and I'm going to slide back this microphone here while I'm hitting a chord. So let's just see what this sounds like, because I want to do this once and not have to reset these mics. Here we go. Now that would be the phase being out because the sound is arriving at the mics at different times. Now, one of the most well-known out-of-phase guitar sounds is probably this song. This is Dire Straits' Money for Nothing from the Brothers in Arms album, which was recorded at the legendary Air Montserrat studio in the Caribbean by engineer Neil Dorfman. So, how the story goes is that the night before, Mark Knopfler, the leader of the band and the guitar player, had auditioned various guitars and amplifier combos, finally settling on a Les Paul Jr. through a Laney combo amp, a 2x12. He was also running through a Morley wah-wah pedal, but instead of moving it back and forth, he had spent some time just adjusting it and found one position just kind of barely open that he really liked. And Neil Dorfman went out there preparing for the next day and just set up some mics near the amp, not really positioning them, just kind of like, here we go. Now, the next day they go into the studio, and Dorfman's practice was to have the band in the control room, and he would go out there and move the microphones around while Mark was playing until they signaled him and said, hey, we like that sound. Mark starts playing, Neil walks out there, and none of these mics had been positioned properly. In fact, one of them the boom stand had slid down and the mic was like pointing at the floor or something like that. Before he could touch anything, they're all in there waving at him saying, we love that sound. Don't touch a thing. Like the mics were out of phase and pointing in weird directions. So he just like, all right, we'll leave it. They're scared to touch anything. Mark Knopfler did like 6 or 7 takes of the song, and then they moved on. Now, he meticulously documented everything that he had done for that setting to try to recreate this sound, and then months later they went to, I think, the Power Station or someplace like that and tried to recreate it, and they never could, so they used what he had recorded. Now, is that cool or what? And finally, the last thing I want to talk about concerning phase and polarity kind of goes back to why I started making this video, which is because a friend of mine had always heard me talking about phase and polarity and said he didn't know what it sounded like and wanted me to do videos about it, and that's why I went down this rabbit hole. But it turns out he was actually referencing something else. You see, he's a connoisseur of earbuds. He gave me a pair right here, and he's always bringing them over for me to listen to, and he had brought over several pairs. I had put a pair on and said, these are out of phase, and took them off. And he's like, well, what does that sound like? And I said, well, just listen. But I was never able to demonstrate it. And it turns out that's what he was referencing. So, George, this part's for you. I'm going to bring up this trim plugin in Pro Tools. And it's very important if you want to do this test to switch the phase or switch the polarity on one side, you got to make sure to turn off this link here. Because if you don't, it will affect the left and right the same. So we're going to do a little test here, and we're going to throw the polarity out on one side. Check it out. And the music you're hearing is from a project I'm working on called the Tokyo Teens. All right, I'm going to switch the left side's polarity. Here we go. Ow. It's almost like it hurts. Okay, now I'm going to switch the right side. I don't know how to describe what that sounds like. To me, it's like one ear's clogged up, or your head's turned weird, or you're in a pipe or something. So that's what I mean, George, when I say the earbuds were out of phase. Actually, one side's polarity was reversed. So now, if that's not bad enough. To make matters worse is if your mix is getting played back somewhere on a mono system and one side's polarity is switched, it sounds like this. Check this out. I'm going to take the master fader here, and I'm going to make it play mono. So here we are playing the mix in mono. I'm going to throw the right side's polarity out. Here we go. You're only hearing the discrete left and right now. Switch to the left side. Terrible. All right, once again, George. Once again, here it is. Terrible. Terrible. Well, anyway, that's all I've got to say about phase and polarity for right now. I appreciate you watching. Remember, support this channel, subscribe, join my Patreon, and I'll see you again soon. And remember, be unique.